There's something unsettling about hotel rooms. Maybe it's the fact that thousands of strangers have stayed in the same bed before you. Maybe it's the feeling that the walls are too thin, that someone might be watching from the other side. Or maybe it's because sometimes you're not really alone. This story was sent to me by a guy named Nathan. It happened when he was traveling alone for work and stayed at a small, off-the-highway hotel. He checked in expecting a quiet night. But what he got was a nightmare. Nathan had been driving for hours when he finally pulled into the hotel. It was one of those old, outdated places, faded carpet, dim lighting, a front desk that smelled like cigarette smoke. The woman at the counter barely looked at him as she handed him the key. "You're in room 207. Just don't bother the room across the hall." That was weird. But Nathan was too exhausted to care. He just nodded, took his key, and went upstairs. His room was normal enough. Old furniture, yellow-tinted lamps, that weird hotel soap nobody actually uses. He set his bag down and collapsed onto the bed. But as he reached for the remote, something caught his eye. The door across the hall. Room 208. The one he was told not to bother. It looked off. There was a keyhole beneath the handle. An old-fashioned one, the kind you don't see anymore. For some reason, Nathan couldn't stop staring at it. And that's when he noticed. There was no light coming from inside. Just darkness. That night, around 1 a.m., Nathan woke up to a sound. A slow, rhythmic knocking. Not on his door. On the door across the hall. Knock. 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 Nathan sat up, his heart pounding. Who the hell was knocking at this hour? It was too slow to be a guest. Too deliberate. Like whoever was on the other side knew he was awake. He waited. Listened. No one answered the door. The knocking stopped. And then a whisper. Right outside his door. "I know you're awake." Nathan didn't move. Didn't even breathe. For a long time, there was silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Dragging. Moving away. Toward room 208. Nathan sat there, heart hammering. Finally, after what felt like forever, he got up. He knew he shouldn't. He knew it was a bad idea. But he couldn't help himself. He crept to his door, pressed his eye to the keyhole, and looked. At first, all he saw was red. A deep, dark, pulsing red. Like something alive. His stomach twisted. He yanked back from the door, heart racing. What the hell had he just seen? He staggered back to bed and pulled the covers over his head. He didn't sleep. Just waited for morning. The next day, he went downstairs to check out. The receptionist was still there, barely looking up from her magazine. Nathan hesitated. Then, finally, he asked. "That room across the hall. 208. What's the deal with it?" For the first time, the woman actually looked at him. And the look on her face was pure fear. Mimicking receptionist's voice, low, uneasy, "There shouldn't be anyone in that room." Nathan felt cold. "But I saw." The woman cut him off. "No, you didn't." Nathan stared at her, speechless. Then, after a long pause, she sighed. "There was a man who used to stay there. Years ago. He was disturbed. Dangerous." Nathan's throat went dry. "What happened to him?" The woman didn't blink. He ripped out his own eyes. Nathan's stomach dropped. The woman turned back to her magazine, like the conversation was already over. "That's why all anyone ever sees through the keyhole is red." Nathan never stayed in an old hotel again. And now, whenever he sees a keyhole in a door, he never looks through it. Because sometimes, what's on the other side is looking back. Stay safe out there. There's something about windows at night that feels wrong. During the day, they're just glass and curtains. But when it's dark outside, and you're inside with the lights on, you can't see out. But something out there? It can see you. This story was sent to me by a guy named Alex. It happened to him when he was 16, and to this day, he still won't sleep near a window. After hearing what happened to him, I don't blame him. Alex lived in a 2-story house with his parents. His bedroom was on the 2nd floor, right next to a big window that overlooked their backyard. It wasn't anything fancy, Just a small yard, a wooden fence, and beyond that, some trees. He had lived there his whole life and never felt uneasy in his own room. Until one night. It was late, probably around 1 a.m. He was lying in bed, half awake, scrolling through his phone when he got this weird feeling. Like he was being watched. At first, he ignored it. Maybe his brain was just playing tricks on him. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It got stronger. Finally, he turned his head toward the window. And froze. There was a face. Outside. Staring at him. Alex's breath caught in his throat. His body locked up. It was just standing there, watching him. But here's the thing. His window was on the second floor. There was nothing outside for someone to stand on. No balcony. No tree branches. Just the wall of the house. The features were stretched, too wide, too sharp, like someone had taken a normal face and pulled it in different directions. Alex couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. Then, the thing blinked. Not like a normal person. Sideways. That snapped Alex out of it. He lunged for his lamp and flicked it on. As soon as the light filled the room, the face was gone. He ran to the window, heart slamming against his ribs, and looked outside. Nothing. Just his empty backyard. No ladder, no ledge, no way anyone could have been up there. But Alex knew what he had seen. And the worst part? When he looked at the glass, there was a handprint. Not from the inside. From the outside. Alex barely slept that night. The next morning, he told his parents. His dad checked outside, but there were no footprints in the dirt below his window. Nothing was on the roof. No sign that anyone, or anything, had been there. They told him it was a nightmare. He wanted to believe them. But then, it happened again. The next time, he was ready. He kept his phone recording on his nightstand, just in case. And, sure enough, at exactly 1:13 a.m., the feeling came back. His skin prickled. His body went cold. He turned his head slowly. And it was there. The same face. Staring. Unblinking. Alex's fingers shook as he grabbed his phone. He hit record and aimed it at the window. For a second, nothing happened. Not like a scream. Not like a person. Too wide. Too deep. And then, it vanished. Alex leapt out of bed, shaking, and checked his phone. He had caught it. A glimpse. A fraction of a second. But when he watched the video back, the face wasn't outside. It was behind him. Inside the room. Alex moved out a year later. He never saw the thing again. But to this day, he still doesn't sleep near windows. And honestly, neither do I. Pause for effect. Stay safe out there. There's something about living alone that makes every little noise feel louder. At first, you ignore them, creaks in the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, maybe even the wind against the windows. But when the noises start sounding like voices, that's when you know something is wrong. This story was sent to me by a guy named Daniel. It happened in his first apartment, a cheap one-bedroom in an old building. He thought he was alone. But he wasn't. Daniel had just moved in, and at first, the place seemed fine. A little outdated, sure, but nothing creepy. His landlord mentioned the building had thin walls and that he might hear his neighbors more than usual. That made sense. Sometimes at night, he could hear muffled conversations through the walls. But then, he started hearing something else. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the vents. At first, it was faint. Just a whispering sound late at night, like someone was talking right behind the air ducts. One night, around 2 a.m., he was lying in bed scrolling through his phone when he heard it clearly for the first time. A voice. Low. Male. Can you hear me? Daniel froze. His body went cold. He sat up, staring at the vent across the room. It was an old metal grate, positioned near the ceiling. The voice had come from inside. His brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe sound carried weirdly through the vents. But then, the voice spoke again. I know you're awake. Daniel felt sick. He grabbed his phone, turned on the flashlight, and aimed it at the vent. Nothing. Just the dull metal bars, slightly rusted, leading into darkness. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Daniel went downstairs to ask the landlord if the vents connected to other apartments. Nope. Those vents haven't worked in years. Building's too old. Daniel's stomach dropped. If the vents weren't connected, and no air was coming through them, then where the hell had the voice come from? That night, Daniel was on edge. He kept his TV on, trying to drown out the silence. But at exactly 2 a.m., it happened again, the whispering. "Let me out." Daniel's body locked up. Nope. No way. He grabbed his pillow and blanket and went straight to the couch, as far from the vent as possible. But just as he was about to fall asleep, there was a noise. A metallic clank. Like something shifting inside the vent. He stared at it, barely breathing. And then, the grate moved. Just a little. Just enough to let him know that whatever was inside the vent was real. Daniel didn't go back to his bedroom after that. The next day, he called his friend Mike to come over and help him check the vent. They got a screwdriver, unscrewed the grate, and shined a flashlight inside. It was deeper than it should have been. The ducts stretched far back, way farther than Daniel expected. Mike aimed his flashlight into the darkness and froze. "Dude. There's something in there." Daniel's breath caught. Mike reached inside, and when he pulled his hand back, he was holding a crumpled piece of paper. Daniel unfolded it, his hands shaking. It was a letter. And it only had 4 words, "I used to live here." That night, Daniel crashed at Mike's place. There was no way he was staying in that apartment another night. The next morning, he went straight to the landlord and demanded answers. The guy sighed and finally admitted the truth. Years ago, a man had lived in that apartment. A paranoid recluse. He started tearing apart the walls, convinced that someone was living in the vents, watching him. Eventually, he disappeared. No one knew where he went. The police searched, but there was no record of him ever leaving the apartment. It was like he had just vanished. Daniel didn't need to hear any more. He broke his lease that same day. And the apartment? It was back up for rent a week later. Sometimes, we hear things at night that we can't explain. A whisper. A scratch. A voice that shouldn't be there. And sometimes, those voices never leave. Stay safe out there. Most people think of their childhood homes as safe places. The place where they grew up. The place where they felt comfortable. But for a guy named Ethan, his childhood home was something else. Because when he was 10 years old, he started hearing the whispers. Ethan grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood. His house was small but cozy, with a backyard, a basement, and a long hallway that led to his bedroom. It was a normal house. Until it wasn't. The first time he heard it, he was lying in bed, half asleep. A whisper. Low. Male. Right outside his door. "Come out here." Ethan's body locked up. At first, he thought it was his dad. But when he called out, no one answered. He lay there, heart racing, staring at his door. And then, the whisper came again. "I know you can hear me." Ethan pulled the covers over his head and squeezed his eyes shut. He stayed that way until morning, too scared to move. When he finally got up, the house was normal. His parents were in the kitchen. His little sister was watching cartoons. Everything seemed fine. So, he convinced himself he had imagined it. That is, until it happened again. A few nights later, he was brushing his teeth in the bathroom. The hallway outside was dark. That's when he heard it. The whisper. Right next to his ear. "I see you." Ethan whipped around. Nothing was there. But the eye, like something had just been there. He ran straight to his room and slammed the door. After that, the whispers started happening more often. Sometimes, they came from the closet. Sometimes, from the vents. But they always said the same things. "Come out here. I see you. I know you can hear me." He told his parents, but they brushed it off. "It's just your imagination, sweetie." But Ethan knew what he was hearing. And he wasn't alone. One night, his little sister ran into his room, crying. "There's a man in my closet." Ethan's blood ran cold. He grabbed his flashlight and followed her back to her room. The closet door was slightly open, Ethan's stomach twisted. He aimed the flashlight at the gap and froze. Because inside the closet, something moved. Ethan slammed the door shut and dragged his sister out of the room. They ran to their parents' room, both of them screaming. His dad stormed in, flicked on the light, and yanked the closet open. Nothing. Just clothes and toys. But Ethan and his sister knew what they had seen, what they had heard. Something was in that house. Something was whispering to them. The worst night came a week later. Ethan woke up around 3 a.m. The house was silent. Until a whisper. Right next to his bed. "Come out here." Ethan's breath caught. The voice had never been this close before. He slowly turned his head. And saw him. A man. Tall. Skinny. Standing in the dark, just inches from his bed. His face was wrong. Too long. Too pale. And his mouth. It didn't move when he whispered. Ethan screamed. The figure vanished. His parents came running, but it was too late. The whispering man was gone. After that, Ethan refused to sleep alone. His parents thought he was just having nightmares. But then, his mom heard it, too. She was up late doing laundry when she heard a voice from the hallway. A whisper. "Come out here." She thought it was Ethan. Until she looked down the hall. And saw a tall, pale figure standing outside his bedroom. When she gasped, it vanished. The family moved out a month later. To this day, Ethan doesn't know what it was. But one thing is certain. It wasn't just his imagination. And it wasn't human. Stay safe out there.